Are you a traditional or an agile web designer? Recently on the WP Builds podcast, we put out a discussion called Realistically Defining Our Business Model. It was the first in our new business bootcamp series where we are relearning everything we know about building sites and running a web design business. And for contrast there, Nathan, the host, has agreed to take on the role of representing a traditional approach while I am going an agile route. What became clear to us in our discussion was just how important it can be to pick an approach which best suits our personality. And I thought this was a topic worth exploring further. So to do this, I've invented 4 web design characters, which I'm calling the entrepreneur, the artist, the fixer, and the enabler. And I'm looking to see whether a traditional or an agile approach might suit these best. And to help this further, I've set up a scale of agility using the 4 values from the Agile Manifesto. So what you'll see are the things that are on the left are valued over the things that are on the right. And on the top right side, you'll see I've labeled that up as traditional to represent the traditional model, where what is delivered at the end is determined by what is pre-agreed before the process starts in earnest. And the opposite of that on the left is the agile model, where the end is determined by what happens as part of a collaborative and iterative testing process. In theory, there is no end because change is inevitable. Now, before I move on to my character types, I wanted to announce that this blog has a sponsor. It's Beaver Builder, the WordPress page builder I've been using since 2014. Much like this blog, they are focused on the needs of freelancers and agency. Beaver Builder is probably best known for its reliability, but quality support and a helpful community are real bonuses. The Beaver Builder team have always shown great respect for the other fabulous builders that are out there. Some of their customers will use more than one, and this is going to be true of this blog too. The best tools are always going to be the ones that best match our individual needs and circumstances. I'm very grateful to the Beaver Builder team for helping me find time for this project. Okay, moving on to our first character, which I've called the entrepreneur. So the key thing is they want to grow their business. Ideally, they want to develop them so they can run without them, allowing them to be able to sell them if they want to. They are most likely to value price projects and set a minimum cost for projects to exclude the lower or even typical budgets. They are usually dynamic people, good at selling, and probably are most heard in web design circles. I believe they are the type here that is most likely to remain on the traditional side of the scale, and that is because fixing internal processes and tools along with planning are key ways in which they work on their business rather than in it. Successful value pricing usually depends on defining a clear end deliverable up front. High-ticket projects tend to require more contract negotiation. The financial rewards of this model are potentially higher, but then so too are the risks. All of the quality issues that started the agile movement in the first place are likely to be found in those longer, higher cost projects. The entrepreneur then will either need to pick their projects very carefully, or they're going to need some charm, a thick skin, and maybe a good lawyer. Of course, they could employ agile practices. In fact, the self-determining Scrum teams seem perfect for the entrepreneur who wants to hand the day-to-day to their employees. But if the team is working to a fixed end deliverable, it's not agile in principle, and the Scrum Masters there would just end up being micromanagers. Let's look at the artists next. They could be trained graphic designers who started in print and learned in web design because that's where the work went. Their skill sets would have evolved over the time to include the technical side of building sites and also digital marketing, but these are likely to be secondary to their visual design skills. I think it's likely that they will see themselves as professionals first and business owners second. And for them, I think the traditional approach that worked for print could still work best for brochure sites if the client trusts the designer to deliver the best to their target audience and lets them get on with it. Often, though, it's not that easy. If a client is too detached from the process, they may seek outside opinions that are likely to be based on personal aesthetic rather than a visitor's profile. Unlike print, websites are more interactive, requiring UI and UX skills, and the design, of course, has to respond to the device accessing it. It has more direct and measurable impact on the owner's business, and of course is powered by ever-changing technology. And the artists themselves might want to get out of the cycle of famine and feast that happens with that type of business by moving into ongoing maintenance relationships. But I think for good reason, the artist may prefer to create in isolation where they can retain control and, importantly, consistency over the design. But web designs include a lot of complexities that go way beyond the visual aspect, and this gives them more reason to closely consider collaboration and iteratively working with clients more. I plan to explore agile approaches to visual design later, but hopefully you might see that by simply removing the ta-da reveal moments in a design process could reduce the dreaded client revision list, those kind of last minute compromises that leaves no one really happy at the end. And I think some of the key benefits for going agile for the artist could be that it puts the client in control of the budget for revision, so they don't lose out as a designer, and there's no reason to say no if they want to experiment further. The client has longer exposure to how the designer works, and that process about finding empathy with a visitor is something which is difficult for someone to understand unless they spend some time with someone, and that I think is a real key thing. And another one is that the designer also gets more exposure to the character of the business and the customers. And in fact, I think I've heard that some large agencies budget some time for informal get-togethers so they can internalize the character of the businesses that they are representing. Let's move on to the fixer next. So for the fixer, web design is really more like a series of business and technical problems to be solved with logic. They are likely to concentrate on more dynamic and functional sites. In terms of our audience, it's likely that they'll be implementing solutions like WordPress rather than be a full stack developer. They may focus on e-commerce, membership sites, learning management system, directory sites, events bookings, etc. Even if not, I think as WordPress implementers, they will probably be doing lots more work with custom post types, custom fields, and they're likely to do more with a forms plugin than simply add them to a contact page. A bit like the artist, I think their business tends to rely on their personal skills, and I think they also could be happy with either a traditional or an agile approach. For example, the requirements of an e-commerce site are often very similar. The page layout and the UX tends to follow a set of already user-tested conventions, so the designer doesn't really need to reinvent the wheel, and arguably these kind of jobs don't require the same level of aesthetic that might be required or prized on a brochure site. Assuming they can get a solid list of what the client wants, such as upsells, subscriptions, delivery notes, then the traditional model might be the best option if both parties are going to be clear up front what needs delivering and there'll be no surprises. And the type of implementation doesn't really leave much of a role for the client. And with large WordPress plugins, functionality is not going to be iteratively added to the platform. However, with other circumstances where they're using perhaps more flexible tools or plugins, pods, ACF, Metabox, Gravity Forms, that kind of thing, or they're coding themselves to create a more customized solution, then an agile approach might be better for the same reasons that it's preferred by software developers. Okay, let's move on to my last type, which is the enabler. So the enabler is a generalist. If you like a jack of all trades and master of none, they enjoy variety and the self-sufficiency it brings, and being self-reliant, perhaps through working on their own projects. They don't have too much time for areas of contention when they're working with others. So if a client has no copy or budget for a copywriter, the enabler is likely to take on the role just to see that progress is being made. Some might mistake them as people pleasers, but as they're not aligned to any particular discipline, they'll just see themselves as pragmatists. Equally, they should be open to handing over work to anyone who could achieve a better result. This could be specialist designers, developers, marketers, SEOs, etc. Anybody really who might come in and help, because they're not going to be precious about any discipline, and that could come from the client's team too. The important thing for them is that projects keep moving forward smoothly, as they would have done if they did it themselves. Now, I suspect this describes many here as I pitch the blog at freelancers and small agencies who do it all. And that's always been my situation. And I believe this type can benefit most from adopting an agile approach because it can give them a model that allows them to work with other people in a structured way without a need for that fight for control and it getting too splintered. So I think this is a really good model for them. Prior to my understanding of the Agile movement, I generally felt out of place as all the training on running a web design focused on the traditional values of process, planning, documentation, and negotiation. Much of it was about establishing a clear us and them in terms of what's expected from the designer and the client. And really, this did not match my own positive work experience. When I was young, I scraped a living as a musician for a number of years. And the most creative things I observed were almost always came out of unlikely collaborations and jamming sessions where iteratively the seeds of someone else's idea would get turned into something far greater than the sum of its parts. Things that could not be planned, ideas needed to fail fast to get to the ones that unpredictably could be developed better. Later, as an employee, I was promoted to a manager role where essentially it was my job to monitor lone workers and see they did things the way that the office wanted. It didn't sit comfortably with me as I didn't get to my position through doing what the office said. And my staff team were the same. They also passed on many of the ideas that I put forward and they were just better at their jobs. Thanks to Daniel Pink's theory of motivation, he has a book called Drive, which I later learned gets referenced a lot in how to run an agile team. I realized that the best thing I could do in this circumstance was reduce my insistence on following the processes set out by the office and give the staff trust, autonomy, and a way to share their ideas with each other. It earned me a bit of a reputation as a Slack manager with an unruly team who spent too much time socializing together, but it really did work. The team picked up numerous excellence awards and the work was just so much more enjoyable. Of course, with these two examples, the very opposite could easily be argued. A classical composer notates everything that musicians play in an orchestra. An autocratic manager also develops efficient teams as well. What I'm really trying to highlight here is that there is just not one correct approach. That's why I'm introducing Agile with this blog to running web design business. The traditional model remains dominant in web design circles, if not elsewhere, but it's not going to be right for every circumstance. And I just believe we are the happiest when we find an approach that is most in keeping with our personality and also motivates the people that we need to work with. Anyway, that's enough for this video. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this. And well, thank you so much if you've got to the end here. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you in another video. Bye-bye.